Heroic motorcyclist defies a police officer to save a K9, and the twist will leave you speechless. The autumn rain pelted against Jake Morrison's visor as he guided his Triumph motorcycle through the winding back roads of rural Pennsylvania. At 45, the former Marine turned mechanical engineer found solace in these lonely rides, away from the bustling streets of Philadelphia where he worked. The wet leaves scattered across the asphalt created treacherous conditions, forcing him to maintain a cautious speed despite the empty road ahead. A flash of movement caught his eye, a large German shepherd bursting from the tree line, its sleek black and tan coat matted with mud and rain. The dog wore a police K9 vest, but something was wrong. No handler was in sight, and the animal moved with a pronounced limp, its right hind leg barely touching the ground. Jake downshifted and pulled over, cutting the engine. The dog froze, hackles raised, but didn't retreat. Years of working with military dogs in Afghanistan had taught Jake to read their body language. This wasn't aggression, it was fear. "Easy there, buddy," Jake called softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he dismounted. "I'm not going to hurt you." The shepherd's ears twitched forward, head tilting slightly. Despite its defensive posture, Jake noticed the dog's tail give a tentative wag. The vest bore the name Shadow in bold white letters, along with Millbrook PDK 9 unit. As Jake took a step closer, Shadow limped backward, whimpering. The sound of an approaching vehicle made them both turn. A police cruiser rounded the bend, its light bar dark but moving with purpose. Shadow's reaction was immediate and alarming. The dog tried to bolt, panic evident in its wide eyes. Jake's instinct screamed that something was very wrong. Police K9s were extensively trained and deeply bonded with their handlers. For one to flee from a police vehicle meant only one thing: abuse. The cruiser pulled up, and Officer Dennis Reeves stepped out, his face twisted in barely contained rage. "Step away from the dog, civilian. This is police business." Jake stood his ground, studying the officer. Reeves was in his late 30s, with close-cropped hair and cold eyes that never quite focused on one spot. His uniform was immaculate, but his gun belt showed signs of frequent drawing, unusual for a small-town cop. "The dog's injured," Jake said evenly. "He needs medical attention." "That mutt is department property," Reeves snapped, taking a step forward. "And he's been interfering with official police work. Now move aside." Shadow pressed against Jake's legs, trembling. The dog's fear was palpable, and Jake's combat-honed instincts were screaming danger. He noticed Reeves' hand hovering near his weapon, a gesture that seemed more threat than habit. "I worked with military K9s for 8 years, Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "No properly trained police dog runs from their handler like this. Something's wrong here, and I'm not leaving until I know Shadow's safe." Reeves' face darkened. "You're interfering with a police officer. Last warning, step aside, or you're under arrest." Jake's hand found his phone in his pocket, fingers sliding to the camera button. "Everything okay here, Officer Reeves?" he asked loudly, making sure to use the name from the officer's badge. "You seem awfully aggressive about a situation that should be simple to explain." The question caught Reeves off guard. His eyes darted to Jake's pocket, recognizing the implied threat of documentation. For a moment, Jake thought the officer might draw his weapon anyway, but then Reeves' shoulders slumped slightly. "Fine," he spat. "Keep the damn dog. But you'll be hearing from the department about this." He climbed back into his cruiser and peeled away, spraying gravel. Jake waited until the taillights disappeared before kneeling beside Shadow. The dog's breathing was rapid, but he allowed Jake to check his leg. The injury wasn't fresh. The muscle was atrophied, suggesting long-term abuse or neglect. "Okay, boy," Jake murmured. "Let's get you somewhere safe and figure this out." He helped Shadow into his motorcycle sidecar, grateful he'd installed it for weekend camping trips. The dog settled in readily, as if understanding Jake was his best chance at escape. The rain was picking up as Jake pulled into his driveway 20 minutes later. His modest ranch house sat on 5 acres of land, plenty of room for a dog to heel and run. Shadow followed him inside without hesitation, shaking water from his coat in the mudroom. Jake's first priority was documenting Shadow's condition. He took photographs of the injuries, the vest, and the dog's general state. Years of working on technical documents had taught him the importance of thorough documentation. Next, he called his sister, Dr. Sarah Morrison, a veterinarian in the next county. "I need you to make a house call," he said when she answered. "And Sarah? This needs to stay off the books for now." Sarah arrived an hour later, medical bag in hand. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes widened at the sight of Shadow's police vest. "Jake, what have you gotten yourself into?" He explained the encounter while she examined Shadow, who proved to be a model patient. Sarah's expression grew darker as she cataloged the dog's injuries. "This isn't just neglect," she said finally. "There's evidence of repeated trauma. The leg injury is at least 6 months old, a simple break that was never properly treated. He's got old bruising, scarring consistent with being struck by a rigid object, and he's underweight. Someone's been abusing this dog systematically." Jake felt his jaw clench. "Can you treat him?" Sarah nodded. "The leg will need surgery eventually, but for now, I can give him pain medication and antibiotics. The other injuries are healing, but..." She paused, running her hand gently over Shadow's head. "Jake, this is serious. Police K9s are expensive assets. They're not going to just let this go." "I know," Jake said, "but you should have seen how that officer was acting. Something bigger is going on here." After Sarah left, Jake spent the evening researching the Millbrook Police Department. It was a small force, just 12 officers serving a community of about 8,000 people. But something caught his eye. Over the past 3 years, the department had gone through 6 K9 officers, all of whom had either resigned or been transferred under unclear circumstances. Shadow lay at his feet, occasionally nudging his hand for attention. The dog's trust in him was remarkable, suggesting he could recognize the difference between good and bad handlers. Jake scratched behind his ears, thinking, "We're going to figure this out, boy," he promised. "Whatever's going on, we'll make it right." The next morning, Jake called in sick to work and made 2 important phone calls. The first was to his old Marine buddy, Marcus Chin, now an investigative journalist in Pittsburgh. The second was to Rachel Henderson, an attorney specializing in police misconduct cases. Rachel agreed to meet him for lunch at a quiet diner halfway between Philadelphia and Millbrook. She was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked black hair and the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. "You're lucky Officer Reeves didn't arrest you," she said after Jake explained the situation. "Or worse, small-town cops with something to hide can be dangerous. What are my options?" Rachel tapped her fingers on the table thoughtfully. "Legally, you're on shaky ground. Police dogs are considered department property and officers. Taking one could be charged as both theft and assaulting an officer. However," she held up a hand as Jake started to protest, "if we can prove abuse and connect it to broader misconduct, we might have a whistleblower case." "What do you need?" "Evidence. Documentation of Shadow's injuries is a start, but we need more. Financial records, incident reports, anything showing a pattern. And we need to move fast. The longer you have Shadow, the more complicated this gets." Jake nodded. "I've got a friend working the investigative angle, but I'm worried about Shadow. They know where I live." Rachel's expression softened. "I know someone who runs a sanctuary for retired police and military dogs. They can take him temporarily, keep him safe while we build the case." The idea of letting Shadow go made Jake's chest tight, but he knew it was the right move. The dog had already been through enough trauma. He needed security more than anything else. That evening, Jake's phone rang. It was Marcus. "You've stepped in at this time, brother," Marcus said without preamble. "I've been digging into Millbrook PD's finances. They've been receiving massive grants for their K9 program, way more than a department that size should qualify for. And get this, every K9 they've had in the past 3 years has been retired due to injury or behavioral issues." Jake looked at Shadow, who was dozing peacefully on his couch. "They're running some kind of scam?" "Looks like it. They get the grants, claim the dogs are damaged goods, then probably sell them off somewhere. But here's where it gets weird. I found connections between Officer Reeves and a fighting ring bust in Ohio last year. He was a witness in the case, but some evidence went missing, and the charges were dropped." Jake felt sick. "You think they're selling the dogs to fighting rings? It fits the pattern. Injured dogs, missing documentation, cash flowing through the department. But I need more proof. Any chance you can get photos of Shadow's vest? The serial number might help us track his paper trail. The next few days were tense. Jake arranged for Shadow to go to the sanctuary, but decided to wait until they had more evidence. The dog's presence was his only leverage, and something told him they were close to breaking the case open. His instincts proved right. 3 days after rescuing Shadow, Jake received an encrypted email from Marcus containing financial records and internal department memos. Officer Reeves and 2 other officers had been systematically abusing the K9 program for years, pocketing grant money and selling the dogs to a network of underground fighting rings. The evidence was damning, but they needed one more piece to make it stick. Rachel suggested they set up surveillance on the department's K9 training facility, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Jake spent 2 nights watching the warehouse, taking photos with a long-range lens. On the 3rd night, he hit pay dirt. An unmarked van arrived after midnight, and Jake photographed Officer Reeves and another man transferring 2 German shepherds in police vests to the vehicle. He was about to leave when a hand grabbed his shoulder. Jake spun around to find himself face-to-face with a badge. "Federal Agent Kate Martinez," the woman said quietly. "We've been watching you watch them. Want to tell me what you're doing here?" Jake's heart raced, but something in her expression told him she wasn't there to arrest him. He took a chance and told her everything, from finding Shadow to Marcus's investigation. Agent Martinez listened intently, occasionally nodding. "We've been building a case against this department for months," she said finally. "But we couldn't get close enough to prove the connection to the fighting rings. Your evidence might be exactly what we need." The raid happened 2 days later. Federal agents stormed the warehouse during another late-night transfer, catching Reeves and his accomplices red-handed. They found evidence of dozens of dogs sold into fighting rings, along with financial records proving years of corruption. Jake watched from a safe distance, Shadow beside him in the sidecar. The dog's ears were alert, but he showed no sign of fear, as if he knew justice was finally being served. The aftermath was swift. Officer Reeves and 4 other officers were arrested on federal charges of fraud, animal abuse, and racketeering. The Millbrook Police Department was placed under state supervision, its K9 program suspended indefinitely. Rachel helped Jake navigate the legal process of officially adopting Shadow. The sanctuary agreed to help rehabilitate other dogs rescued from the fighting rings, but Shadow had already found his forever home. 6 months later, Jake sat on his back porch, watching Shadow chase butterflies in the spring sunshine. The dog's leg had healed well after surgery, though he would always have a slight limp. It didn't seem to bother him as he bounded through the tall grass, his tail wagging with pure joy. The screen door creaked, and Agent Martinez stepped out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd become a frequent visitor, her initial professional interest in the case evolving into something more personal. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, handing him a mug. Jake smiled, watching Shadow roll happily in a patch of clover. "Just thinking about how sometimes the worst situations bring out the best in people. And animals." Kate nodded, settling into the chair beside him. "The therapy program is going well. Those fighting ring dogs you helped rescue? 3 of them have been rehabilitated and placed with veterans suffering from PTSD. They're changing lives." Shadow trotted up to the porch, dropping a well-worn tennis ball at their feet. His brown eyes, once filled with fear, now sparkled with mischief and trust. "You know," Kate said, reaching down to scratch Shadow's ears, "when I first started investigating this case, I thought it was just about corruption and money. But it turned out to be about something much bigger. The bonds between humans and animals, and how those bonds can heal even the deepest wounds." Jake threw the ball, watching Shadow bound after it with enthusiasm. "He saved me as much as I saved him," he admitted. "After Afghanistan, I was just going through the motions, keeping to myself. Shadow gave me a purpose again, a reason to fight for something bigger than myself." The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Shadow returned with his ball, but instead of dropping it for another throw, he settled between their chairs with a contented sigh. "The department's K9 program is starting up again," Kate mentioned. "New handlers, new protocols, regular oversight. They've asked me to consult on the training program. I thought maybe you and Shadow might want to help out sometimes," Show them how it should be done. Jake looked down at Shadow, who gazed back with complete trust and affection. From scared and abused to helping train the next generation of police dogs, it was a journey neither of them could have imagined that rainy day on the back road. "What do you think, boy?" Jake asked, ready to help make sure no other dogs go through what you did. Shadow's tail thumped against the porch boards, and he pressed his head against Jake's leg. The answer was clear. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Jake reflected on how a single moment of courage, choosing to stop and help a frightened dog, had sparked a chain of events that exposed corruption, saved countless animals, and brought healing to an entire community. But most importantly, it had brought him Shadow, a partner and friend who proved that even in the darkest situations, compassion and bravery could light the way forward. Kate's hand found his in the growing darkness, and Shadow's warm weight pressed against their legs. Together, they watched the first stars appear, knowing that sometimes the most heroic acts aren't about dramatic rescues or daring raids. Sometimes they're simply about having the courage to stop and help someone in need, human or animal, and trusting that love and justice will find a way.